Imagine a war so long that an entire generation was born, grew up, fought, and died without ever knowing what the word peace meant. A war so chaotic that the French fought the Spanish, the Swedes fought the Germans, and the Germans fought themselves. It was the World War of the 17th century, a conflict that killed 8 million people and redrew the map of the world. But it didn't start with a grand strategy or an invasion. It started because 3 guys got thrown out of a window. To understand why a broken window triggered an apocalypse, you have to look at the map. The Holy Roman Empire, that massive, confusing patchwork of 1,000 tiny states in the middle of Europe, was sitting on a fault line. 60 years earlier, they had signed the Peace of Augsburg, a treaty designed to stop Catholics and Lutherans from killing each other. It operated on a simple, slightly insane rule: Caius regio, eius religio, or whose realm, his religion. If your local duke was Catholic, you were Catholic. If he woke up one morning and decided to be Protestant, congratulations, so were you. If you didn't like it, your only option was to move. For a while, this worked, but by 1618, the system was rotting. A new, more radical form of Protestantism, Calvinism, was spreading, and the treaty didn't recognize it. This coincided with the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of brutal winters and poor harvests that made the peasantry desperate, superstitious, and prone to apocalyptic thinking. A great comet appeared in the sky in 1618, and across the empire, people whispered that it was a sword of fire, a herald of doom. Meanwhile, a new generation of hardline Catholics was taking power, trained by Jesuits to despise compromise. The wood was dry, the oil was poured, and all Europe needed was a match. The match was lit in Prague, the capital of the wealthy kingdom of Bohemia. Bohemia was a unique place, mostly Protestant, fiercely independent, and rich. But in 1617, the emperor named his cousin, Ferdinand II, as the new king of Bohemia. Ferdinand was a nightmare scenario for the Bohemians. He was a devout Habsburg Catholic who reportedly said he would rather rule a graveyard than a heretic kingdom. He had been raised by Jesuits who taught him that heresy was a disease that had to be cut out to save the soul of the state. He immediately began closing Protestant chapels, banning their gatherings and censoring their grievances. On May 23, 1618, the Bohemian nobles had finally had enough. Led by Count Thurn, an old soldier with a temper and a personal grudge against the monarchy, they marched up the stairs of Prague Castle. They burst into the council chamber, cornering the king's representatives, Slavata and Martinitz. Thurn didn't mince words, telling them they were enemies of the state who were trying to destroy their ancient rights. The discussion turned violent immediately. There was no trial. The nobles grabbed Slavata, Martinitz, and their secretary, dragged them to the window, and shoved them out. It was a 3-story drop, roughly 70 feet. In 1618, this should have been a liquidation. But when the rebels looked down, expecting to see broken bodies, they saw the 3 men standing up. They were bruised, limping, and terrified, but alive. The Catholics screamed it was a miracle, and that the Virgin Mary had caught them in her shawl. The Protestants looked down at the dry moat and muttered that they had simply landed in a giant pile of horse manure that the castle servants had neglected to clean up. Miracle or manure, the result was the same. The victims fled to Vienna to tell Ferdinand what happened. This was the second defenestration of Prague, and it was the point of no return. The Bohemians knew they couldn't turn back now. You don't try to kill the king's men and then just apologize. They raised an army, and the 30 Years' War had begun. The Bohemians needed a new king to replace the one they just tried to kill, so they chose Frederick V of the Palatinate. On paper, he was perfect. He was the head of the Protestant Union. He was rich, and he was the son-in-law of James I of England. His wife, Elizabeth Stuart, was ambitious and charming, reportedly telling him she would rather eat sauerkraut with a king than roast beef with an elector. The Bohemians assumed that if they picked him, the powerful Kingdom of England would have to help them. They were wrong. King James I was a pacifist who hated rebels, even if they were led by his own family. Frederick accepted the crown and moved to Prague in late 1619, but his fellow monarchs mocked him. They called him the Winter King, betting he wouldn't even last until spring. While Frederick was throwing parties in Prague and alienating the locals with his Calvinist iconoclasm, Ferdinand II was building a death machine. He made a deal with his relatives in Spain to send veteran troops and reached out to the Duke of Bavaria to reactivate the Catholic League army. In November 1620, the imperial hammer came down at the Battle of White Mountain, just a few miles outside Prague. This battle shows exactly why the war lasted so long. Mismatched professionalism. The Bohemian army was a ragtag group of militias and mercenaries who hadn't been paid in months, suffering from low morale and poor leadership. The imperial army, led by the brutal but brilliant Count Tilly, was a professional killing force utilizing the Spanish tercio formation, massive, moving fortresses of pikemen surrounded by musketeers. On a foggy morning, Tilly ordered the charge. It was a slaughter. The Bohemian cavalry fled. The infantry was crushed by the sheer weight of the Catholic pike blocks, and the battle lasted less than 2 hours. King Frederick was eating lunch in the palace when he heard the news. He didn't even try to rally the city. He packed his crown jewels and ran away, earning his nickname forever. The aftermath in Bohemia was brutal. 27 rebel leaders were beheaded or hanged in the old town square, their heads put on spikes and left there for 10 years as a warning. Bohemia was forcibly converted to Catholicism, the German language was prioritized over Czech, and the culture was effectively erased for 3 centuries. Ferdinand had won, and the war should have ended in 1621. But fear is a powerful motivator. The Protestant princes of northern Germany looked at the headless bodies in Prague and thought, "We are next." They saw the emperor not as a restorer of order, but as a tyrant who would strip them of their lands and religion. So, they called for help. Enter Christian IV of Denmark, the cool uncle of European kings. He was wealthy, ambitious, loved to drink, and commanded a powerful navy. In 1625, he marched into Germany to save Protestantism and perhaps annex some lucrative river tolls for himself. To fight Denmark, the emperor needed more men, but he was broke. This is where the war changes from a religious conflict into a capitalist enterprise. A minor Bohemian noble named Albrecht von Wallenstein approached the emperor with a proposal that sounded impossible. Wallenstein was an enigmatic figure, prone to violent outbursts, obsessed with astrology, and plagued by chronic pain. He offered to raise an army of 50,000 men at no cost to the emperor. When the emperor asked how he would pay them, Wallenstein replied with a chilling maxim: "War must feed war." Wallenstein invented the modern military-industrial complex, creating a predatory economy where his army acted like a moving city of locusts. They didn't just defeat enemies, they stripped the land bare. He created a system of contributions, which was a polite word for extortion. If a town refused to pay his tax, it burned. If it paid, it starved. Wallenstein and the veteran Count Tilly crushed the Danish king in battle after battle, pushing him all the way back to the sea. By 1629, Wallenstein had an army of 100,000 men and was the most powerful man in Europe. He was so sensitive to noise that when he entered a city, he ordered all the cats and dogs killed so he could sleep. Ferdinand II, drunk on victory, made a fatal mistake. He issued the Edict of Restitution, demanding that all land taken by Protestants in the last 70 years be returned to the Church. It was a massive overreach that terrified everyone, even the Catholics, who realized the emperor was trying to become a dictator. The princes forced Ferdinand to fire Wallenstein to curb his power, and Ferdinand agreed, thinking the war was won. He was wrong. The turning point wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. In May 1631, the imperial army besieged the city of Magdeburg. When the walls were finally breached, discipline completely collapsed. The soldiers, unpaid and hungry, went berserk. They set fire to the city and slaughtered the inhabitants in an orgy of violence that shocked the world. Out of 30,000 citizens, only 5,000 survived. They hid in the cellar of the cathedral while the city burned above them. Magdeburg Quarter became a new slang term for showing no mercy. The Catholics thought this would terrify the Protestants into submission, but it enraged them instead. Propaganda pamphlets detailing the roasting of children and the rape of women spread across Europe. The Protestants knew now that surrender meant death. Luckily for them, a savior had just arrived on the shores of Germany, Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. History calls him the father of modern warfare. While the Spanish and Austrians were still using massive, slow-moving blocks of men, Gustavus revolutionized the battlefield. He thinned his lines out to maximize firepower, integrated light, mobile cannons that could move as fast as infantry, and drilled his musketeers to fire in volleys. He introduced paper cartridges to speed up reloading and cross-trained his cavalry to work in sync with his artillery. He called his army a machine, and he was the engineer. But he was also a charismatic leader who led from the front, often getting wounded alongside his men. The test of this new machine came on September 17, 1631, at Breitenfeld. On one side were the invincible Catholic veterans under Tilly. On the other, Gustavus and his Swedes. Early in the battle, the Catholic cavalry charged and routed the Swedes' allies, the Saxons. The Saxon army fled the field, leaving the Swedes exposed. It looked like another Catholic victory. But Gustavus didn't panic. His flexible units pivoted, literally turning 90 degrees in the middle of combat to face the flank attack. His musketeers unleashed devastating volleys, firing 3 times faster than the enemy. His mobile artillery blasted grapeshot into the dense Catholic squares. The imperial army, too rigid to react to this fluid style of warfare, was annihilated. It was the first major Protestant victory of the war, and the Lion of the North had proven that the emperor could be beaten. Desperate, the emperor had to swallow his pride and recall Wallenstein. The warlord agreed to return, but only on his own terms, effectively making him an independent ruler. The two greatest military minds of the age finally met at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632. The battle was fought in a dense, freezing fog. Visibility was zero. It was a chaotic nightmare of muzzle flashes and screaming in the mist. In the confusion, Gustavus Adolphus led a cavalry charge to plug a gap in the line. He got separated from his bodyguards. He was shot in the arm, then the back, and finally killed by a pistol shot to the temple. The Swedes eventually won the battle, fueled by a rage to avenge their leader, but finding their king's body stripped and face down in the mud made the victory feel like a funeral. With Gustavus dead, the emperor felt safe again, and his paranoia turned back toward Wallenstein. Wallenstein had begun to conduct his own secret peace negotiations, acting more like a king than a general. Ferdinand decided he had to go. In 1634, with the emperor's blessing, a group of Irish and Scottish mercenaries broke into Wallenstein's bedroom in the town of Eger. The great warlord, suffering from gout and unarmed, stood up and opened his arms to accept the blow. They ran him through with a halberd. In the span of 2 years, the war had consumed its two greatest figures. Now there was no one left to lead. The war exploded into something even more cynical: the French phase. Up until 1635, the war had maintained a thin veneer of religious conflict, but then France, a deeply Catholic nation, declared war on Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. The French Prime Minister, Cardinal Richelieu, was a man of the cloth, but he cared more about raison d'etat, national interest, than religion. He knew that if the Habsburgs won, France would be surrounded by a mega-empire. So, in a supreme act of irony, The Catholic cardinal funded the Protestant armies to kill Catholic Spaniards. This final phase lasted 13 years and was the closest Europe has ever come to an apocalypse. It became a war of attrition. Armies ceased to be military units and became roving cities of bandits. The discipline of Gustavus was gone. We have diaries from this time describing villagers baking bread made of sawdust and acorns. Soldiers used a torture method called the Swedish drink, where they forced a victim to swallow gallons of raw sewage to make them reveal where they buried their money. Plague followed the armies, wiping out entire towns. In the region of Brandenburg, half the population died. In some areas, wolves roamed through the centers of abandoned villages in broad daylight because there were no hunters left to stop them. Cannibalism was reported in the Rhineland. It was a total societal collapse, a dark age in the middle of the 17th century. By 1648, everyone was exhausted. The treasuries were empty, the soldiers were mutinying, and the land was dead. The powers of Europe gathered in Westphalia to hammer out a peace. It was a diplomatic nightmare that took years. They spent the first 6 months just arguing about who sat where and in what order they entered the room. But eventually they produced 2 treaties that made up the Peace of Westphalia. The terms were a humiliation for the emperor. The German princes were granted the right to choose their own religion, now including Calvinism, and the Dutch Republic and Switzerland were officially recognized as independent countries. Most importantly, Westphalia established the concept of state sovereignty, the idea that a country has borders, and what happens inside those borders is the business of that government alone, not an emperor or a pope. It was the birth of the modern international order. The war started because a king tried to enforce his religion on his people, and it ended with the realization that total war for total ideology yields only total destruction. The window in Prague had finally been closed, but the House of Europe would never look the same again.